In 2003, a young nun vanished during midnight prayer inside an old monastery nestled deep in the French countryside, leaving behind only a flickering candle and a single unanswered question. For 20 years, the bell tower remained silent, until one dawn it rang again, without a truth buried beneath decades of sacred stone. It was the kind of night that wrapped the hills of St. Adalbert Monastery in a velvet hush, the thick fog curling between old stone walls like breath from the earth itself. Midnight prayers had ended minutes ago, yet the candlelight still flickered behind stained glass windows, casting soft reds and blues on the worn flagstones outside. Inside the chapel, a faint scent of frankincense clung to the air, and the hush of reverence hadn't yet settled into the familiar silence of sleep. Sister Maria was the last to leave the altar that night, or at least she was supposed to be. She was known for staying a few minutes longer, kneeling in contemplation while others slipped away into the cloisters and bedrooms. It wasn't uncommon. Maria, at 29, had a kind of quiet devotion that people admired from afar. She never sought attention. She loved the ancient hymns, the sacred rhythm of silence, the comforting creak of pews under the weight of prayer. But that night, something was different. By morning, her absence was not just noticed, it was alarming. Her shoes were found neatly placed beside the pew she frequented. Her white veil, the symbol of her vows, had been carefully folded and rested on the prayer cushion. But Maria was gone. The chapel doors had remained locked from the inside all night, confirmed by Mother Agnes herself, who held the only key. No sign of forced entry, no witnesses, only a faint breeze that seemed to whisper through the corridor between the altar and the bell tower. At first, no one wanted to speak it aloud. The other sisters exchanged worried glances, whispering psalm verses and clutching their rosaries tighter than usual. But the absence grew louder with each passing hour. Search parties scoured the grounds, the woods behind the monastery, the garden paths, the well. All combed thoroughly, dogs brought in from the county found no scent trail to follow. The village constable questioned everyone, even examined her room, which remained untouched, bed made, desk organized, as if Maria had simply evaporated mid-thought. Then came the discovery that shifted everything. Sister Irene, a younger nun who'd gone back to retrieve her forgotten rosary, noticed something odd on the lectern near the pulpit. A prayer book, not Maria's own breviary, but one of the standard parish copies used by visitors. It was open to Psalm 130, "Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord." Scribbled neatly in the margin, in handwriting that matched Maria's, was a single sentence: "I have heard the call from the bell tower, and I must go." It made no sense. The bell tower had long been disused. The mechanism had rusted over. The bell hadn't tolled in years, since the last lightning strike damaged the pull system. Sister Clara confirmed it. She'd been the last to attempt ringing it during a vigil in '98 and nearly injured her hand. Besides, the door to the tower was bolted shut. Yet the note was real, and no one could explain why Maria would write such a thing. The bishop's representative arrived days later, not only to investigate, but to contain what he called gossip, before it disrupted the sanctity of the monastery. But stories already swirled. Some whispered that Maria had seen visions, that she'd spoken in tongues days before, that she'd been called by something not of this world. The older sisters dismissed it as hysteria, but younger novices exchanged glances behind candlelight, repeating the sentence over and over. "I have heard the call." Meanwhile, the bell tower loomed silently above them all, its rusty mouth watching, its hatches sealed tight. At night, some claimed they saw a faint glow behind the old slats, just the moonlight, surely. Or something else. One morning, a visiting priest attempted to access the tower, but found the interior stairs collapsed from rot decades ago. Yet there were prints, fresh ones, on the dust leading up the step. No one could explain that either. Mother Agnes tried to calm the sisters. She increased the frequency of group prayers, forbade anyone from going near the tower, claimed that Maria had likely wandered off into the forest, perhaps overwhelmed by private despair. But no body was found. No footprints, no evidence of a woman walking away on foot. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed Maria whole. But Sister Claire, the youngest among them, could not forget what she had overheard the night before the disappearances. A soft clang, faint, metallic, 3 distinct rings that echoed through the thick monastery walls. She'd dismissed it as a dream, but now she wasn't so sure. The monastery began to change. Even Major Perfect settled over the convent, like morning frost. A statue of Saint Cecilia in the hallway outside the chapel was found turned, ever so slightly, facing the bell tower. No one admitted moving it. Even more disturbing, Mother Agnes began showing signs of illness, fatigue, forgetfulness, confusion. She swore she heard Maria's voice in the chapel, reciting evening prayers aloud when no one else was there. They prayed harder. They sang louder. They avoided the tower. But nothing filled the hollow space left by Maria. Then, exactly 20 years later, to the very minute of her last known prayer, it happened. The bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times, and the air inside St. Albert cracked like ice underfoot. In the weeks following the sudden disappearance of Sister Maria, St. Albert Monastery transformed from a place of serene devotion to a space thick with unanswered questions and nervous glances. Though life attempted to return to its monastic rhythm, something intangible had shifted. The chapel remained open for prayer, the kitchen still prepared humble meals, and the novices still swept the halls and lit candles each morning. But under the surface, a shared anxiety pulsed like a second heartbeat. And then the bell rang. It was exactly 1 month after Maria vanished. The sound was unmistakable, deep, metallic, hollow. 3 solemn tolls echoed across the sleeping monastery at midnight, waking nearly every soul within the ancient stone walls. The sisters rushed to windows and doorways, eyes wide, rosaries clutched tightly. But when they looked toward the bell tower, there was no movement, no figure, no open hatch, just the black silhouette of the broken tower beneath the stars. The next day, several sisters confirmed the impossible. The bell had rung, though the ropes had been removed and locked in the sacristy since the incident. Mother Agnes, who had long insisted on silence regarding Maria's case, ordered the sisters to dismiss it as a wind accident or perhaps a faulty pipe echoing through the masonry. But then it happened, again. Another midnight, another set of 3 tolls. The frequency increased, sometimes every night, sometimes skipping 2 or 3, but always at or near midnight, always 3 rings, never 4. It became a ritual of dread. Some nights the sisters would lie awake waiting for the sound. When it didn't come, they'd sleep uneasily, only to jolt awake on the next when it returned. Eventually, some began hearing it even during the day, phantom echoes where none should exist. The groundskeeper confirmed no structural mechanism could make the bell move. Its clapper had been wedged in place for decades. There were no ladders, no signs of tampering, and the locked entry to the tower remained untouched. Word spread to the surrounding village. Curious visitors arrived under the guise of religious interest, but often lingered near the bell tower, snapping photos, whispering conspiracy theories. The church, worried about sensationalism, tightened control. A new bishop arrived and began asking pointed questions, and through it all, Father Raymond, the monastery's abbot and spiritual guide for nearly 30 years, grew increasingly withdrawn. At first he carried himself with his usual calm authority, quoting scripture, leading mass, reminding the sisters that faith required mystery. But as the tolling persisted, something in him began to unravel. He often stood alone near the base of the tower after dark, looking up with a hollow expression. He forgot verses during homilies, stumbled over psalms he'd known since youth, and was twice found wandering the gardens barefoot in the early morning hours, muttering fragments of Latin hymns. One morning he called an emergency meeting in the chapter room. The sisters gathered in a semicircle, their breath visible in the cold winter air, the windows fogged from within. Father Raymond stood before them, clutching his worn Bible like a shield. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I can no longer serve this place," he began. "For a year I have tried to rationalize what we've all experienced. The bell, the wind, the dreams. But I must now admit something. I hear her." A shiver rippled through the room. "Every night," he continued, "at the hour the bell rings, I hear singing. Not imagined, not faint, clear, a woman's voice rising through the stone like water from a hidden spring. She sings the Sanctus, always the same." The sisters sat in stunned silence. "And it is her voice," he said finally. "She's not at peace. I don't believe she ever left." No one interrupted, not even Mother Agnes, whose face had drained of color. The room held its breath. Then, without ceremony, Father Raymond placed his Bible on the altar, bowed his head, and walked out. By the end of the week, he had filed for reassignment to a retreat center in northern Oregon. He left behind his cassock, his crucifix, and a handwritten note pinned to the chapel door that simply read, "The tower sings her grief. Do not let it become ours." His departure marked a turning point. With no abbot to enforce structure, the monastery's hierarchy began to loosen. The sisters grew quiet, guarded. Mother Agnes, already fragile in health, aged visibly in weeks. She began speaking to herself more often, holding private masses in the empty chapel, occasionally forgetting what year it was. During one such mass, she referred to a visitor as Sister Maria, then collapsed moments later from exhaustion. The nurses said it was stress. The younger sisters weren't so sure. Meanwhile, Sister Claire, now 20, and increasingly drawn toward the tower, confessed to waking at the precise moment of the bell's toll each night, even when it did not sound. She began sketching the bell tower in her notebooks compulsively, sometimes drawing windows or doors that didn't exist. Once she described seeing light flicker in the highest slats of the tower, soft and blue like moonlight reflected on water. No one else saw them, or at least no one else admitted to seeing them. Then came the journal. A mason restoring the eastern wall of the cloister uncovered a small metal box hidden within the stone. Inside was a weathered leather-bound book filled with entries in Maria's handwriting. Most were standard devotional reflections, but one entry, dated 3 days before her disappearance, stood out. "The dreams have returned. The bell calls me, not in sound, but in something deeper, a vibration in the marrow. I see the tower not as it is, but as it was, new, golden, breathing. I must go. I must see what it wants. I am not afraid." Mother Agnes forbade the journal from being copied, but its presence added fuel to a fire that no longer could be hidden. That spring, a local paper published an anonymous account from a former abbey priest confirming that multiple reports of supernatural activity had been submitted to the diocese between 2002 and 2004, all dismissed quietly. The article was pulled within days, but the seed was planted. Pilgrims started arriving at St. Adalbert not for prayer but for prayer. The monastery tightened again. Tours were suspended, the outer gate padlocked. But within those walls, the sound of 3 bells at midnight had become part of the rhythm of life, a liturgical haunting, an echo without a source. Until one night, the bells rang not 3 times, but once. And then silence. Not a peaceful quiet, but a weighted stillness that made the sisters hold their breath and listen harder. That night, Sister Claire did not wake up screaming. Instead, she spoke in her sleep, a single sentence: "She's waiting." The 20-year anniversary of Sister Maria's disappearance arrived with the kind of muted solemnity that had become custom at St. Adalbert Monastery. By now, most of the original sisters had either passed away or retired to other convents. The new faces, younger and less burdened by the memory, treated the date with reverence, but little personal connection. Only Sister Claire, now fully professed and 39 years old, held on to the memory with the urgency of someone who had never stopped searching. Though she was merely a novice when Maria vanished, the mystery had shaped her life, deepened her vocation, and carved a quiet space in her soul that nothing else could fill. The monastery had adapted to modernity in subtle ways. An unobtrusive security system had been installed a few years prior after a series of trespassing incidents. Cameras were placed discreetly, one above the main entrance, another facing the outer gardens, and one, almost as an afterthought, positioned to capture the base of the bell tower. It had never recorded anything of significance. Until now. At precisely midnight on the anniversary, the bell rang again. 3 solemn tones reverberated through the monastery, rousing every sister from sleep in the same heart-pounding instant. The tones were not echoes or imagined sounds. They were full, resonant, and deliberate. Sister Claire sat up in bed, heart racing. For the first time in years, she didn't feel fear. She felt explaining. As she rushed to the window, her breath caught in her throat. There was a light, no, a flicker, emanating from the slatted windows of the bell tower. Not moonlight, not electrical glare, but something softer, warmer, like candlelight in motion. She wasn't alone in seeing it. Several sisters gathered in the courtyard, whispering, crossing themselves, pointing upward. The flicker lasted only a few moments, long enough for doubts to scatter, then it vanished, leaving the tower in its usual darkness. The next morning, the security team reviewed the footage. Sister Claire sat with them, hands trembling as she gripped her rosary. What they saw confirmed everything and opened new doors of horror. At 11:59 p.m., the camera captured the still courtyard bathed in moonlight. At 12 o'clock, the screen trembled ever so slightly as the first toll of the bell cut through the silence. At 12:01, the flicker appeared in the top right corner of the feed, a faint amber glow from within the bell tower. Then, at 12:02, a shape, no, a figure, emerged behind the thin lattice of the tower window. A woman, standing motionless, dressed in white, not modern white, but the old-style habit worn in the early 2000s, before the uniform changed. Her face wasn't visible, obscured by shadow and distance, but her posture was unmistakable, upright, reverent, like someone waiting for prayer to begin. The figure remained for 30 full seconds, then, as if dissolving into the dark itself, she vanished. Not stepped away, not walked, vanished. The camera feed glitched for 2 frames afterward, an anomaly never before recorded. The file was backed up immediately. The sisters were not shown the footage en masse, but word spread quickly, fueled by urgency and dread. Some refused to believe it. Others wept. Mother Luciana, the current abbess, remained quiet for most of the day, retreating to her office with the footage and a locked drawer of documents passed down from Mother Agnes, who had died a decade earlier under circumstances never fully disclosed. That afternoon, Sister Claire requested permission to access the upper levels of the bell tower for the first time since the incident. She expected refusal. Instead, Mother Luciana looked at her for a long moment, then handed her the iron key worn with age. "You won't find her there," she said softly, "but maybe she'll find you." The door to the tower creaked open reluctantly, the rusted hinges shrieking after years of disuse. Dust and cold greeted Claire like old, unkind friends. The spiral staircase was intact, though the higher rungs bore warning signs of decay. Slowly, carefully, Claire ascended, one hand on the rail, the other clutching the rosary that had once belonged to Maria, gifted to her by a relative who found it hidden in a hymnal years ago. As she climbed, she whispered prayers under her breath, words half remembered, half revealed. The belfry was small, cramped, and smelled of mildew and age. The bell loomed above like a silent sentinel. Its clapper had not moved. The light flicker, if real, had left no trace. No candles, no soot, no warmth. But then she saw it. A single white thread looped around one of the wooden beams, fluttering gently in the breeze, seeping through the slats. Not spider silk, cloth, and beside it, embedded in the wood near the window, was a hairpin, silver, antique, with a cross motif she recognized immediately. She had seen it in a photo of Maria taken before her final vows. Claire reached out and touched it. The metal was warm. Later, in the refectory, the sisters sat in near silence as Claire described what she found. A collective unease settled over them. Not fear, anticipation, as if something was building, like the pause before a hymn, the inhalation before a storm. The abbess convened an emergency council where they reviewed the footage again, frame by frame. A visiting technician attempted to debunk the image. He couldn't. There were no sources of light in the tower, no possible projection angles, no logical explanation. Claire offered her theory. The tolling of the bell wasn't a haunting, but a message. A signal, a marker in time. "She's waiting," Claire said, "but not to be mourned, to be found." That night, the bell didn't ring, but the air was heavy with unfinished music, as if the tower itself were holding its breath. The sisters returned to their rooms. Claire remained in the chapel, staring at the crucifix and the candlelight flickering over Maria's portrait, now displayed once more. Outside, the tower stood silent, watching, waiting. In the weeks following the mysterious reappearance of the midnight bells and the flickering light in the tower, the atmosphere at St. Adalbert grew increasingly electric, like a low humming wire stretched taut across the courtyard. While the older sisters clung to routines with desperate fervor, whispering rosaries with trembling fingers, the younger ones, especially those new to the convent, found themselves drawn to the mystery, compelled not by fear, but by something else entirely. Among them was Sister Clara, a postulant barely 21 who had arrived just 6 months prior. Quiet, observant, and deeply devout, Clara had not drawn much attention to herself, though her presence carried an unspoken gravity. She had told the abbess upon arrival that she'd been orphaned at birth, raised in foster homes, and always felt a pull toward sacred spaces, especially ones near forests or bell towers. No one thought much of it at the time. That changed when she began sleepwalking. The first incident was minor. Another sister found Clara barefoot in the hallway at 3 a.m., mumbling to herself and facing the window that overlooked the bell tower. The second time, she was discovered standing at the base of the locked chapel doors, hands clasped in prayer, ora pro nobis, over and over, in a voice not quite her own. But it was the third incident that caused true alarm. She had wandered through 3 locked doors without keys, navigating the monastery halls in total darkness, and was found standing beneath the bell tower with her eyes closed, singing an ancient Latin hymn, Veni Creator Spiritus, in perfect pitch and pronunciation. The audio was recorded on a sister's phone and later confirmed by Father Damien, a retired linguist from the seminary, to be in an early ecclesiastical dialect no longer taught. The phrasing, cadence, and accent suggested familiarity beyond mere memorization. Clara had no memory of any of these events. When shown the footage, she grew pale, insisting she had never studied Latin beyond basic church phrases and certainly had no idea how to access those areas at night. Medical evaluations began shortly thereafter, prompted both by concern and curiosity. Sleep studies were inconclusive, revealing no neurological abnormalities, but her brain activity during REM sleep was unusually high. She entered a state of what researchers described as prayer-stationed dissociation, a trance-like rhythm of breath and whispered verse that mimicked monastic chants with eerie precision. Intrigued, one of the visiting doctors suggested a DNA analysis to determine if there might be a genetic memory or ancestral link influencing her behavior, especially since Clara's parentage was officially unknown. The abbess, hesitant at first, eventually agreed, citing the need for answers. The results arrived 2 weeks later, and they changed everything. The report showed a 94% mitochondrial DNA match to Maria de Lourdes, the same Sister Maria who had disappeared 20 years earlier. Initially, the lab assumed a clerical error, but cross-referencing with diocesan records, hair samples recovered from the convent confirmed the unthinkable. Clara was Maria's biological daughter. The realization rippled through the monastery like a silent earthquake. A missing sister, long presumed dead, had left behind not only a mystery, but a living legacy, walking among them unknowingly. The implications were staggering. How had Clara come to be? Where had she been raised? Who had hidden her existence, and why? Confronted gently, Clara broke down in tears. She confessed she had always felt haunted by a presence she couldn't name. Dreams of dark staircases, of candlelight flickering on stone walls, of a woman in white, flicking lullabies in a voice she never heard while awake. She remembered a necklace she once found in an old toy chest, a rosary made of carved wood and copper beads, with the initials M.D. She had kept it for years without understanding its origin. Now it all made sense. Or rather, it didn't. Not yet. But a thread had been found, and Sister Clare, who had long held vigil for Maria, took Clara under her wing with renewed purpose. Digging through old records, Claire and Clara pieced together fragments of an untold story. Around the time of Maria's disappearance, a midwife in a neighboring village had reported an abandoned newborn left at the steps of the mission hospital, wrapped in cloth bearing the child Saint Albert. The child was healthy, quiet, and nameless. The hospital baptized her as Clara, after Saint Clare of Assisi. No one had ever come forward to claim her. A single note had accompanied her, "God will raise her as his own." The writing matched Maria's. What became clear, though still only in shadowy outline, was that Maria had vanished because she was pregnant, something forbidden in her vocation. The theory grew that someone in the church had discovered her condition and issued a choice: disappear quietly or face disgrace and expulsion. Maria, choosing neither shame nor confrontation, had fled. But fled to where? And how had Clara ended up abandoned yet miraculously cared for? There was more to this than a forbidden pregnancy. Claire was convinced Maria had been hidden, or perhaps imprisoned. The night Clara learned the truth, she did not cry. She did not run. She went to the chapel and lit every candle, then knelt at the altar for hours, whispering prayers to a mother she never knew but now felt living in every breath. The bell tower remained silent that night, but Claire noticed Clara sleep more peacefully than ever before. As the days passed, Clara's sleepwalking ceased. The sisters observed a calmness settle over her, as if the storm within had finally paused. Yet one question burned brighter than the rest. If Maria had hidden Clara for her safety, then who had helped her? Who else knew? And if she was still alive, had the bell been her way of calling her daughter home? Claire pressed further into the archives, seeking blueprints, maps, any structural details that could explain how Maria might have disappeared without trace. A sealed wing beneath the old infirmary caught her attention, long closed off due to structural instability. But the map suggested otherwise. A tunnel, once used as an emergency evacuation route during the war, had been walled off shortly after Maria vanished. No one had investigated it in years. That night Clara dreamed again, this time not of staircases or chance, but of a candle flickering beside a stone door, a door with her name carved into it. She awoke with a start, whispered Mater Mei, and rushed to find Claire. The abbess met them in the hall, already awake, as if expecting them. In her hand was an old iron key wrapped in cloth. She said nothing, only the iron key the abbess handed to Claire, and Clara felt ancient in the younger sister's hand, its weight disproportionate to its size, as though carrying decades of silence. Wrapped in faded cloth and kept in a hidden drawer within the abbess's office, the key had no label, no engraving, only a small tag attached with red thread bearing one word, handwritten in Latin, Aditum. No one knew how long the abbess had possessed it or who had first passed it to her, but the way she nodded in silence as she handed it over spoke volumes. Claire and Clara retreated to the chapel, their footsteps echoing against the stone floors, and began searching the archives in earnest. They were looking for anything, architectural plans, blueprints, even rumors about hidden structures beneath the monastery. Claire recalled passing mention, long ago, that St. Albert had once been a refuge during the war, though those records were incomplete at best. They spent hours combing through the library, finding only fragmented floor plans, most of which had been water-damaged or annotated in fading ink. It wasn't until Claire pulled down one of the monastery's oldest printed messals, bound in cracked leather and untouched for decades, that they made their breakthrough. Tucked between Psalm 91 and Psalm 92 was a folded map drawn in exquisite detail and marked with notes in Latin and German. The map showed not only the chapel, refectory, and cloisters, but also a long, narrow corridor stretching beneath the structure, leading to what was labeled as Refugium 13. The path extended directly under the bell tower, branching into what appeared to be several small rooms before terminating near the edge of the forest. Claire leaned over the map, her finger tracing the tunnel. "This room?" she whispered, pointing to a square marked with a faint cross and the word oratorium. Claire's breath caught in her throat. An oratorium, private chapel, hidden underground. With the key in hand and the map as their guide, they knew where to go next. That evening, as most sisters gathered for vespers, Claire and Clara slipped into the cellar beneath the west wing, following the oldest staircase, one rarely used, since renovations in the late 80s. At the base, behind a crumbling brick wall partially obscured by storage crates, they found it. A rusted metal hatch embedded into the floor. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease. A deep mechanical click echoed through the chamber, and the hatch creaked open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. They lit 2 lanterns, Clara's from the sacristy, Clara's from the garden tool shed, and began their descent. The air was thick, unmoving, and smelled faintly of old waxen earth. The tunnel's walls were narrow and lined with smooth stone, older than any part of the current monastery. They walked in silence, each step muffled by the dust of decades. They walked in silence, each step muffled by the dust of decades. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Claire checked the map again, her lantern casting long shadows across the parchment. "To the right," she murmured, "toward the oratory." Turning, they followed the new path until it curved and widened into a modest chamber. The door ahead was wooden, reinforced with iron bands, and fitted with a second keyhole, one that matched the size of the key they carried. Claire inserted it, turned gently, and heard another satisfying click. The door swung inward slowly, revealing a room so still it felt untouched by time. A single iron-framed bed rested in the corner, its sheets faded but neatly arranged. A small wooden altar stood against the far wall, adorned with a white cloth and a wooden crucifix, its base carved with the same initials found on Clara's old rosary. M.D. Books lined a narrow shelf above the altar, mostly warm prayer books, some theological reflections, and one hand-stitched journal. The walls had been whitewashed, but now bore stains of candle smoke and time. Atop a wooden desk sat a melted candle, its wax pooled beside a brass dish, still holding ash, and what looked like remnants of old herbs. Clara stepped forward and ran her hand across the blanket. "Someone lived here," she whispered, awestruck. "Not hid, lived." Claire nodded, lifting one of the books. Inside its cover, a note was taped. "In silence, I find God. In darkness, I am not alone." The handwriting was unmistakably Maria's. The journal, delicate and leather-bound, chronicled the daily thoughts of whoever had stayed there. The first entries were simple: prayers, meditations, reflections on Scripture. But further in, the tone shifted. There were passages about fear, about confinement, about a child. Claire read aloud one entry, dated exactly 9 months after Maria's disappearance. "She is here, small, perfect, and mine. I named her Clara, after the saint whose light pierces all shadows. I pray one day she will walk free in the sun and not bear the shame I carry now. If I must remain here, so be it. But she will know God above and love without fear." Clara's knees gave out as she knelt beside the bed, tears falling without restraint. Her hands clutched the frame and her head bowed low. Claire knelt beside her, holding her shoulder. The journal had many more entries, some detailing days of singing, of remembering hymns, of a longing to return above, but also of visits. One entry mentioned a name, L, described only as someone who brought food, candles, and news from the monastery. Whoever they were, they had helped Maria survive, and perhaps helped Clara escape. Another entry read, "I hear the bell in my sleep. Even if the rope is gone, I hear it. Perhaps it is heaven calling me home." Claire stood and moved to the altar, pursuing her lantern beside the crucifix. In the flickering light, she noticed something hidden beneath the altar cloth. Pulling it back gently, she revealed a narrow wooden hatch, fitted with a different kind of lock, this one newer, more modern. There was more to this sanctuary, more below, more hidden. Claire reached into her coat pocket, retrieving the abbess's keyring. One of them bore the same etched cross as the hatch. The key slid into the newer hatch beneath the altar, with a sound both mechanical and strangely organic, like breath held for too long, finally being exhaled. Claire twisted slowly, heart pounding, while Claire stood beside her, silent, her hands clasped over her chest, as if to brace herself against something already forming within. When the lock disengaged, the wooden panel lifted with surprising ease, revealing a steep wooden staircase descending further into the darkness. Wood newer than the stonework above, mightly built after the first chamber. Claire held up her lantern, illuminating only the first few steps before blackness swallowed the rest. Without a word, Claire stepped forward, lantern in hand, and began her descent, her movements sure and unafraid. Claire followed close behind, every sense heightened, as the air grew colder and denser, scented with mildew and something faintly metallic, like the breath of iron. The steps creaked but held, each one releasing tiny clouds of dust with every footfall. At the bottom, the tunnel widened again into a space unlike the modest orient above. It was not a place meant to be found, not a place meant to comfort. A single chair rested near the back wall, facing a small wooden cross nailed into the stone. A table stood beside it, partially rotted, with the remains of melted candles, an empty cup, and a cloth-wrapped bundle hardened with age. Claire approached the chair slowly, and as she ran her hand along its warm backrest, a memory surfaced, not vague, not dreamlike, but sharp, sudden, and complete. She saw herself, barely 5 years old, sitting on the stone floor, her legs tucked under her, while a woman in white whispered prayers beside her. The woman's voice was soft, but filled with a sorrow Clara hadn't understood then. She remembered the rhythm, the melody, and the way the woman would sometimes sing instead of speak, her eyes distant, as if reaching beyond the walls. "Mater mia," Clara breathed aloud, and her knees gave out again, but not from shock. This time it was reverence. She fell into a kneel, hands trembling, tears already welling. Claire moved quickly to the bundle on the table. Carefully unwrapping it revealed a second journal, far older and more damaged than the first. Its pages were brittle, edges flaking like dried leaves, the ink faded to sepia. Yet the handwriting was unmistakable, Maria's. The entries in this journal were different, raw, fragmented, desperate. The first pages repeated a single phrase multiple times, as though Maria were trying to convince herself it was true. "I am not unclean. This was not my sin. God sees the truth." Claire turned the pages slowly, her breath catching as she began to piece together what Maria had never spoken aloud. "He came to the chapel often," one entry began. "He said I was chosen. He said obedience was holiness. I believed him." Another, written shakily, simply read, "It was not until the bleeding stopped, and never came again, that I understood what had happened. I was not sick, I was with child, and I was afraid." Clara closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from surprise, but from recognition. Somewhere in her soul, she had always known. The sadness, the disconnection, the ache she could never name, it was inherited, passed through womb and silence. She had withdrawn to the retreat chambers, then disappeared through the tunnel she herself had discovered decades earlier during renovation work. She wrote of crafting the oratory herself, of giving birth in darkness, alone, with only whispered prayers and the echo of chapel bells to guide her. "I did not run from God," she wrote in one passage. "I ran so she would not inherit my shame. I called her Clara, not after me, but after light." One of the final entries struck Claire deeply. "I hear the bell now. It rings for me. But I am not ready. She is not yet safe. When the time comes, it will toll again, and then I will know it is finished." Claire stood slowly, her face transformed not by rage, but by resolve. "She knew," she said. "She knew this would happen. She built this place for both of us." Claire nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the journal as she closed it gently. But questions remained. Who helped Maria survive? Who brought supplies, offered silence, protected her secret for so long? The name had appeared several times in the first journal, and here again in a nearly illegible scrawl. "Elm said the new bishop suspects. I must prepare. He has keys to the sacristy and comes without warning. I fear he knows. If he finds Clara, he will not spare her." This wasn't just fear, it was a warning, one that had possibly come too late. Claire stared at the wall behind the cross. "There's something else," she whispered, "something hidden." She stepped forward, placed her palm flat against the stone, and closed her eyes. "When I was small," she said, "she would carry me here. She would sing to this wall, and I would fall asleep." Claire stepped beside her and ran her fingers along the seams. One section of stone bore shallow indentations, as if someone had knelt there often. With effort, they pulled away loose stones near the base, revealing a hollow. Inside was a small tin box, crusted shut. Claire forced it open with a knife from her belt. Inside were several folded papers, photographs, and what appeared to be part of a priest's stole, cut and stained. One photograph showed Maria, pregnant, standing in shadow with a man in clerical collar beside her, his face mostly obscured by a blur, but the initials LL were scrawled on the back, along with the date April 2003. Claire's breath hitched. He helped her, but maybe not out of kindness. Claire said nothing, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the photograph. The walls felt closer now, the air heavier, as if the chamber itself held its breath in mourning. From somewhere above, faintly, came a vibration, soft, harmonic, like the first note of a hymn. Claire looked up sharply. Claire whispered, "She's singing again." They stared at each other, lanterns flickering, hearts pounding with the certainty that this wasn't memory or imagination, but presence. Maria had been hidden, buried in the silence of injustice, but her voice had returned, and she was not finished speaking. Not yet. The name Elle echoed through Claire's mind like a bell strike of its own, growing louder with every passing moment as the dust settled around the hidden tin box. The initials matched no one currently on record at St. Albert Monastery. They had to belong to someone from before, someone carefully removed from collective memory. They had to belong to someone from before the Aberter brother stayed behind in the underground chamber, her eyes closed, moving in silent prayer. In the dim lamplight of the archives, Claire scanned every file she could find from the years leading up to Maria's disappearances. Most records were meticulous: assignments, letters, disciplinary actions, even liturgical inventories. But one folder stood out by its absence. The personnel files from 2003 were missing 4 pages. One of them, curiously, bore a torn label that once read, "Father Lucien." Her pulse quickened. The surname was missing, scrubbed. There were no photographs, no correspondence. Only a single line, written in the corner of a transferred disciplinary note that read, "Moved to overseas mission by order of Curia, June 2004. Determined, Claire contacted a former diocesan archivist, now retired, who had quietly helped her once before. When she mentioned the initials and year, there was a long pause. "Father Lucien Moretti," the man finally said. "You didn't hear that from me. He was investigated by Vatican authorities in 2005. Allegations of misconduct, manipulation, and improper relationships with multiple religious sisters during his time in North America." Claire's blood turned cold. "What happened to him?" she asked. "The church reassigned him overseas, Africa, I believe, then disappeared. No official charges, but a sealed report was filed. It was ugly. The archivists didn't elaborate, only added, 'I remember one line from that file. Possible paternity in one case, evidence inclusive due to mother's disappearance.'" Claire ended the call with trembling fingers. Claire had the right to know, but she also had the right to hear it gently. She returned to the chamber, finding the younger woman kneeling before the small cross, holding the journal tightly to her chest. Claire knelt beside her and spoke softly, carefully revealing what she had learned. "I always wondered," she said quietly. "I never felt truly safe, even in church. Maybe I've carried some of her fear in me all along." Claire placed a hand on her shoulder. "She didn't just disappear because she was ashamed. She was silenced, threatened. They erased him from the records, but not from her life." Claire nodded slowly, and when she realized she was pregnant, they must have demanded she leave, or worse. The pages of the journal confirmed it. One entry, scrawled in the margins, read, "He said if I spoke, I would bring shame to the whole order. That I misunderstood. That I tempted him. But I was afraid, not of shame, but of him. I knew his reach. He had friends in the diocese. I could not leave. I could not run. So I buried myself instead." Maria had chosen the only form of defiance that protected both herself and her unborn child. Vanishing, that fleeing. By disappearing within the monastery rather than outside of it, she had stayed close to her faith and out of his reach. She used the very walls that once protected him to shield herself. Over the years she wrote less often, her entries growing shorter but no less potent. "She learns fast. I hum the Kyrie, she sings it back. I wonder if the sound of bells comfort her the way they used to frighten me." Another, "I fear she will grow without sunlight, but her eyes shine like the stars above. I cannot see." Claire realized then that Maria's survival had not been cowardice or martyrdom. It was the ultimate act of maternal strength. Alone, cut off, terrified, she had built a sacred prison rather than risk exposing her daughter to a world that dismissed her pain. Clara turned to Claire, her voice firm. "I want to speak with the abbess. We need to bring this to light." Claire agreed, but also knew that such revelations came with consequence. The church had a long history of covering its wounds instead of cleaning them. When they approached Mother Luciana the next morning, the abbess was already waiting in the garden. Her eyes were tired, as if she'd known all along that this moment would come. Claire told her everything: the journals, the chamber, the truth of her birth, and the man who had fathered her under the guise of spiritual leadership. The abbess listened in silence, then opened a locked drawer from her desk, revealing an envelope marked MMN in faded ink. Inside was a letter, unopened, addressed to "My child, for when you are ready." Maria had written it in 2005 and entrusted it to the previous abbess, with instructions never to give it to anyone but her daughter. "I kept it," Luciana said, "because part of me always hoped Maria was alive. When the bells rang again this year, I knew something was returning." Claire unfolded the letter with shaking hands. It read, not like a confession, but a blessing. Maria explained her decision, her hope, her love, and her deep belief that Clara would one day walk in light where she had lived in shadow. "I was not strong enough to fight him," the letter read, "but I was strong enough to raise you with truth and prayer. Forgive me for hiding you. I only wanted you to be free." Clara pressed the paper to her lips, and for the first time since the journal had revealed the horror, she wept, not in pain, but in relief. The abbess gave her blessing to continue investigating, promising her support if they chose to bring this forward. But Claire knew the story was still incomplete. There were still missing pieces. Where had Father Lucian gone? Who had helped cover for him? And how far did the silence extend? More disturbingly, what had Maria meant in one of her final entries? "When the bells ring again, it will be time." Claire believed the bells were not just memory. They were signal, instruction, prophecy. Something had been set in motion, not only by Maria, but by forces spiritual and unseen. And Clara, now armed with truth, stood at the center of it all. That night, Clara dreamt again, not of shadows, but of light breaking through the cracks of stone. A voice called her name, clear and strong, singing. The melody was familiar, one from childhood, a lullaby whispered in Latin. And Clara, standing in the dream chamber, sang it back. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the monastery, casting vibrant patterns on the stone floor. Sister Clara sat in the chapel, the journal of her mother, Maria, resting on her lap. The revelations of the past days weighed heavily on her, yet they also brought a sense of clarity. The silence of the chapel was interrupted by the soft creak of the wooden door. Claire entered, holding an aged envelope in her hand. "This arrived today," she said, handing it to Clara. The envelope was yellowed with age, the handwriting delicate but firm. Clara opened it carefully, revealing a letter and a small familiar object wrapped in cloth. Unwrapping the cloth, Clara gasped. It was a silver rosary, its beads worn smooth from years of use. The crucifix at the end bore the initials M.D.L. Maria's. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she clutched the rosary to her chest. She unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "Dear Clara, if this reaches you, it means I have departed this world. I have watched over you from afar, praying for your happiness and safety. I entrusted this rosary to Brother Thomas, who has cared for me in my final years. May it bring you comfort and remind you of my love." Claire sat beside Clara, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Brother Thomas," she mused. "He was the gatekeeper here years ago. He left suddenly, and no one knew why." Claire nodded, memories surfacing. "I remember a kind man who used to bring us food and supplies. He never spoke much, but his presence was comforting." Claire stood, determination in her eyes. "We need to find him. He might have more answers." The journey to the countryside was serene, the rolling hills and blooming fields a stark contrast to the turmoil of recent events. They arrived at a quaint cottage nestled among trees, smoke curling from the chimney. An elderly man opened the door, his eyes widening in recognition. "Sister Clara," he whispered, emotion thick in his voice. "You've grown into a fine woman." Inside, the cottage was modest but warm. Photographs adorned the walls, including one of Maria holding a baby Clara. Brother Thomas poured tea, his hands trembling slightly. "Maria was like a daughter to me," he began. "When she fell ill, I knew I had to help. The monastery had turned its back on her, but I couldn't." He recounted how he had secretly transported Maria to his home, caring for her as her health declined. "She spoke of you often, her heart aching with love and regret. Clara listened, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't she come back? Why didn't she let me know? Brother Thomas sighed, his gaze distant. She feared for your safety. The past had hurt her deeply, and she didn't want it to touch you. He handed Clara a small box. She asked me to give you this when the time was right. Inside was a locket containing a picture of Maria and a lock of her hair. As they prepared to leave, Brother Thomas mentioned one final detail. The night Maria passed, the bell tower rang. I thought it was my imagination, but now I believe it was her spirit bidding farewell. Claire and Claire exchanged glances, the mystery of the bell tower, the rosary in her hand. She gazed out over the grounds, the windows gently rustling her habit. She felt a sense of peace, knowing her mother's love had transcended time and distance. The bell above her swayed slightly, its chime resonating through the air. A final goodbye, a mother's eternal love echoing in the wind. The morning light fell gently on the monastery grounds, casting long golden rays over the stone pathways and flowering vines that crept along the ancient walls. Sister Clara stood beneath the bell tower, her hands wrapped around the silver rosary that had once belonged to her mother. In the quiet she could still feel the echo of the final chime, the farewell toll that had rung out the night they learned of Maria's passing. But more than that, she felt presence, not ghostly or spectral, but grounding, a warm certainty that something lost had returned. Claire approached from the chapel, a soft smile on her face. "The abbess called a meeting," she said gently. "They're ready." Inside the cloister hall, the atmosphere was solemn yet hopeful. The abbess, seated at the head of the long wooden table, looked up as Claire entered. Several elders from the diocese had gathered, along with the archivist consultant who had helped trace the timeline of Maria's life. There were also 2 nuns from another convent, women who had known Maria in her youth and remembered her as a woman of deep integrity. The investigation into Maria's past, launched quietly and without media attention, had uncovered extensive evidence not only of her innocence, but of the Church's silent complicity in suppressing her story. The journals, letters, and testimonials provided by Brother Thomas had all been authenticated twice, both by ecclesiastical and independent experts. And now it was time to acknowledge what had long been denied. The abbess stood and addressed the room. "It is with both sorrow and gratitude that we confirm Sister Clara as the daughter of Sister Maria de Lourdes. We accept the truth of her origin, not as a scandal, but as a testimony to the strength of a woman who bore suffering in silence to protect her child." She turned to Clara, her voice steady. "You are not an outsider here. This is your home. It always was." Clara bowed her head, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "Thank you, Mother," she whispered, "for seeing her, for seeing me." Over the next few weeks, Clara made her decision. She would not leave. Despite the pain, despite the memories woven into every stone, she felt more tethered here than anywhere else. She chose to take her final vows, not only as an act of personal devotion, but as a continuation of the life her mother had been forced to abandon. The day of her vow ceremony was quiet, intimate, and profoundly sacred. Claire stood as her sponsor, and the abbess laid the white veil gently over her head, echoing the ceremony Maria had once undergone in the very same space. As Claire knelt before the altar, she whispered a final prayer, not for protection or clarity, but for peace. "Let the truth live here," she said. "Let no woman be hidden again." But Clara's mission did not end with vows. She took it upon herself to write Maria's story, not as a confession, but as a testimony. With the abbess's permission, she accessed every archival record, every letter, and every journal. She spoke with the surviving sisters who remembered Maria's gentle nature, her musical gifts, and the way she would always hum hymns in the gardens during morning work. Clara wrote with reverence, but also honesty, preserving the pain without sensationalizing it. She detailed the manipulation, the fear, the abandonment, but also the courage, the faith, and the quiet rebellion that allowed Maria to protect what she loved most. The manuscript was titled The Hidden Light, the story of Sister Maria de Lourdes. It was reviewed and approved by the abbess, then sent to the diocese, accompanied by a letter signed by the monastic community requesting formal acknowledgement and posthumous honor for Maria's service. The bishop, after reading both the story and the attached evidence, responded with a formal letter expressing remorse for the institutional failures of the past and issued a declaration clearing Maria's name of any impropriety. "Her silence was not consent," he wrote, "but a sacrifice rooted in love. Let her name be restored to our prayers, and her example guide us in protecting the vulnerable." A ceremony was held weeks later, quiet but attended by sisters from neighboring convents, priests, and even lay people who had followed whispers of the story through Catholic forums and small spiritual circles. A new plaque was added to the monastery's memorial garden, bearing Maria's name, along with the inscription, "She chose silence to protect a voice not yet born." Claire stood before the plaque with her hand resting gently on its stone. "You are seen," she whispered. Claire, who had walked beside her through every discovery, watched from a distance, a deep sense of closure warming her chest, but even as they honored the past, she couldn't shake the feeling that one thread remained untied, one name, one figure, still shadowed in silence. Lucien Moretti. Though the church had investigated him, and whispers of his reassignment had surfaced, no one had confirmed his final whereabouts. And if Maria's final entries held any meaning, his influence had not been completely severed. There were still questions left to answer, wounds that might not have fully healed. That evening, after the ceremony, Claire returned to her small room in the east wing of the monastery. She placed the manuscript draft on her desk beside the rosary and locket. As she prepared for evening prayer, a soft knock came at the door. It was the abbess. She held a sealed envelope. "This came for you," she said. "It has no return address." Claire opened it cautiously. Inside was a single page, hand-handed in thick, deliberate script. "Your voice is louder than I expected, but not louder than mine. Be careful what you awaken." Claire, reading the note over Clara's shoulder, felt a chill settle in her spine. The handwriting matched none of the others they had studied, but the message was unmistakable. Someone else knew. Someone was watching. The sun had not yet breached the horizon when the sisters gathered in the courtyard, each one cloaked in their white habits, huddled together in reverent silence as the air brimmed with expectancy. Sister Clara stood apart from them on the stone steps leading up to the bell tower, the hem of her robe trailing against the dew-drenched stone, her hands clasped tightly around the same frayed rope that had once hung dormant for years. The cold of dawn bit at her fingers, but her heart was calm, grounded not in the memory of loss, but in the certainty of purpose. Above her the bell awaited, motionless yet alert, as if listening for the sound that would summon it into life one final time. The air felt still in that suspended moment, not heavy with grief but quietly sacred. Claire stood at the base of the tower, eyes locked on Clara with quiet encouragement, knowing what this act would mean, not just for the monastery or the sisters, but for Clara herself. The silence cracked softly as the sun's first golden beams crept over the eastern trees, slicing through the chill and illuminating the tower. Claire took a deep breath, then pulled. The rope strained and gave, and the bell answered. Its voice rang out across the hills, low and pure, shaking dust from the stones and birds from their nests. It wasn't the startled toll of ghostly nights past, nor the mysterious echo of grief buried in stone. It was deliberate, human, a call and a closure, a goodbye and a beginning. The sisters below bowed their heads in unison, and the courtyard filled with the bell's long, resonant note. As the final peal drifted into silence, Clara remained still for a moment longer, her eyes raised toward the bell, lips moving in silent prayer. Later that morning, Clara and Claire returned to the underground chamber beneath the monastery. The space no longer felt like a secret grave, but a sanctified crypt, a place where a sacred life had once grown in the darkness, shielded not by fear, but by fierce maternal love. In the center of the small room, they placed a new addition, a modest statue of the Virgin Mary, hand-carved by one of the local craftsmen, from olive wood, her expression one of gentle sorrow from fierce protection. At the base of the statue, etched into a brass plaque, were the words Clara had chosen herself, "Silence to nurture life, and faith still endures." Claire lit a candle beside it, its flicker dancing in the soft shadows, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The room had heard enough silence and enough suffering. It now bore witness to truth, memory, and resilience. In the days that followed, news of Maria's story began to spread, not through scandalous headlines, but through whispers of reverence. A priest from the diocese wrote a homily referencing the unnamed saints among us, who chose love over reputation. A visiting nun from Rome requested a copy of Clara's manuscript, and within the monastery itself, a subtle but irreversible shift had taken place. The bell tower, once avoided, became a place of meditation. The old journals were preserved in the library under special care, and the underground chamber was open to prayerful visits for those seeking solace from past wounds. Clara resumed her daily routines, tending the herb garden, teaching scripture, and guiding new postulants through the rhythms of monastic life. But she also became something more than a sister. She became a symbol, not of martyrdom, but of reclamation. Not of vengeance, but of redemption. One afternoon, weeks after the ceremony, Claire found Clara seated under the olive tree near the chapel, writing again. "Another chapter?" Claire asked. Claire smiled, closing the notebook. "A letter. To my mother. Not to ask why, just to thank her for choosing to live in silence so I could have a voice." Claire sat beside her, the breeze rustling the tree branches above. "She would be proud of you." Clara looked toward the bell tower, now golden in the afternoon sun. "I hope she knows I didn't just survive what happened. I continued it, transformed it. She planted something in secret, and now it grows in the open." That evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a gentle chime rang from the chapel, this time not from the tower, but from the small handbell Clara carried to mark the end of the prayer hour. The sisters gathered quietly, their voices joining in hymn, the melody echoing softly through the stone corridors, no longer haunted, but hallowed. In a final act of closure, Clara took the remaining pages of Maria's original journal and placed them inside a sealed reliquary, to be kept in the chapel for future generations. Not as an object of veneration, but as a testament to truth, the kind of truth that lives not in fire and accusation, but in the enduring light that rises when silence is finally broken. And though the bell in the tower would ring again, many times in years to come, it would never again ring in mourning or mystery. Its voice now belonged to the living, to the memory of a mother who once hid to protect a daughter, and to that daughter who rose to speak not only her own name, but the name of every woman who had ever been told her pain was best kept quiet. The past remained, but it no longer ruled. The shadows still fell in the hallways, but they no longer hid what had been hidden. And in the quiet of each new morning, as the sun bathed the monastery in gold, and the sisters rose in prayer, the light was fuller, clearer, blessed not just by heaven above, but by the courage of those who chose to speak beneath it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more untold mysteries like this one. What part of the story left the strongest impression on you? Do you think Maria made the right decision in hiding? And by the way, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you.